How are you today? Awesome. Well, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:33 famously said, "Bad company ruins good morals." This quote from Paul is actually interesting because it's very likely that he is quoting a poet in the ancient world who wrote this in one of his poems or plays, and it became kind of like a common cultural proverb by the time that Paul was writing, almost a cliche. You know, we have those same things today, but Paul says this in the context of his letter to the Corinthian Christians because, well, they had an unfortunate habit of embracing people that claimed to wear the name Christ follower, but who chose to live in a way that deviated from their calling. And Paul was constantly throughout the letter of 1 Corinthians trying to call people to not go that way and not to embrace a wayward life. But of course, this quote has become popular even in common self-help literature these days. If you read anything written by someone trying to teach you how you can get ahead in life, they may say things like, hey, if you want to know who you're going to become in 5 to 10 years, just look around the people that you're hanging around with. If you want to climb the ladder at work, if you want to have more money, if you want to have better health, all these different things that people strive after, they would say, look at the people around you and the things that they do because you're going to be influenced by them. And of course, we push this idea in modern culture, and it sounds good, and it might even be provable if you do studies on it for a while. The problem with taking this quote and running that direction with it is, well, you run into a story like the one that we're going to run into today in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to be looking today at Jesus' calling of the tax collector Levi today. And tax collectors, as we'll see in just a moment, were not exactly popular individuals, not only amongst the Jewish people at the time of Jesus, but really in the culture at large. If you study enough Greco-Roman writings, you will find sections where philosophers and teachers in those cultures even ripped on tax collectors at the time and said they were beneath what people should strive to be. But before we get there, I want to paint a picture of the situation, and I want to kind of recap where we've come from. Jesus came to the area of Capernaum, hanging around the Sea of Galilee, and made his home base there, as we kept pointing out last week. You can see this. This isn't exactly a map. I guess it is a map, but it's an aerial shot of the Sea of Galilee, and you can see along the shore the different towns that Jesus would have navigated as he did his ministry. And you can see up there in the top middle, you can see Capernaum. Of course, if this were on a map, that is the northern section of the Sea of Galilee shore. So you're looking at the northernmost part of the Sea of Galilee. And you can see Bethsaida, Chorazin, the inlet of the Jordan River. You can see Tiberias, Magdala. Now these regions were governed or ruled by Herod Antipas. He was a ruler from 4 BC to about 39 AD. And Herod was the son of Herod the Great, or Herod the Despicable, really. And he was the de facto ruler. Of course, in this culture, he was called a tetrarch. And the reason for that name was, technically speaking, he got to rule over a quarter of a province. It was kind of a way of keeping the lesser rulers in check by the greater rulers of Rome. If you've ever seen The Office, do you remember how Dwight Schrute was commonly referred to as the assistant to the regional manager? Anybody? I mean, he didn't even get to wear the title assistant regional manager. We always had to be reminded that he was the assistant to the. Even though he had such little power, Dwight had that power go to his head constantly. And while we can chuckle at someone like Dwight on The Office, it's quite true to the world that Jesus was walking around and doing ministry in. Herod Antipas, even though he was only a quarter ruler of the province of Galilee and Perea, it went to his head, as it did with all the Herods. He wanted to rule everybody under his thumb, and he wanted to keep them there. And one of the ways in which the ruling parties and ruling principles and powers and people would keep people under their thumb was through the means of taxation. And they would set up these tax booths, and they would hire out people that lived in these regions to be tax collectors. And oftentimes when we think about tax collectors, we might get it a bit more simplistic than we ought to, because there were levels of tax collector. Basically, in some sense, it could have almost been like a pyramid scheme where you got the person at the top and then people subordinate to them, and then you had people that were on the lower rung. And most of the time, the people on the lower rung of the tax collecting scheme were the people that were plucked from the regions that they lived in. Of course, in this world, it was hard to find work and hard to make a living. And so naturally, people looking for work to do, that needed work to do, that couldn't find anything else that they could do, would succumb to the opportunity to be one of these lower-level tax collectors. And so even though the tax collecting enterprise ended up serving the ruling class and more pointedly the Roman overlords of the day, Jewish people that lived in places like Bethsaida and Capernaum and Chorazin would yield and become tax collectors in this lower-level sense. Of course, they were taught, if they wanted to get ahead, to add surcharges that they could take off the top to pocket themselves before turning it in. And then what was taxed got upcharged. And you can see how this became a problem as it went up the ladder. The people at the top made the most money, but even the people on the lower rungs stood something to gain, and therefore that's how they made a living. Now, last week, when Jesus is walking around the Sea of Galilee, we noted that he called some fishermen. And fishermen, they would go out all night sometimes on the Sea of Galilee, and they'd throw out their nets, and they'd catch what they could, and they'd bring it in. And it would be processed. They'd either sell the fish wholesale, or even in Magdala, down here next to Tiberias, it was common practice for that fish to be processed and turned into a bit of a fish salsa. Doesn't that sound good? Anyway, it might not sound good to you, but it's very popular at this time. So these fishermen were running a lucrative business, but thanks to this taxation structure, they were getting ripped off for the work that they were doing. And ultimately, they were being ripped off by the people that were in charge, like Herod Antipas. But naturally, anytime we feel like we're being ripped off, we're going to have a dislike of the people that are reporting to the people ripping us off. And say if you lived in this world, tax collectors were, well, they weren't good. They were lumped in with the lowest of low, the scum of the earth. Because they were making your making a living really hard to make a living. Sorry if that was confusing. So Jesus is in Capernaum, and in the beginning of chapter 2, he's at his home base, and as we identified last week, he is staying in the home of Simon and Andrew. We know that he heals Simon Peter's mother-in-law, and so he is at this home, he is making this his home base. And in the beginning of chapter 2, word has got out so much about what Jesus is saying and what he's doing that people are coming and flocking to see him. When he's at the synagogue, people come to synagogue to hear his teaching. And even when he goes home, people come and they bring their sick They're diseased. They're spiritually stricken loved ones to Jesus. And in early chapter 2, the people are coming in so often and in such great numbers to see Jesus that no one can fit in the home. And so what do? Well, one group bring their friend that can't walk on a mat. They get up on top of the roof and they dig out the top of it as best as they can, and they lower him down from the top. Now, I got to think Simon, by the way, at this point is probably like, should I follow this guy? Because now my roof needs to be fixed. Of course, Jesus heals the individual, and not only that, he forgives his sins, and the religious leaders hear that, and they're like, wait, what? But it's the story that comes after that in Mark chapter 2 that we want to look at today. It's the calling of Levi. And it actually echoes the calling of the fishermen. And it's the point in the story where you're following along Jesus and you like what he's saying, you like what he's doing. He's bringing power, he's bringing authority that the scribes themselves don't have. It's like God has shown up and he's made his home our home base. And not only has he made his home our home base, but now he's calling disciples. And we like when Jesus calls fishermen to be disciples, or maybe fellow carpenters, or maybe field workers. We can get behind those disciples. Why? Well, they're good, upstanding, religious Jewish people, hungry for the faith, open for the Messiah to show up. We can get behind being a part of that group. And then Jesus calls someone that would have made their eyebrows go up. It starts in verse 13 of Mark chapter 2. It says, Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. And as he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collection station. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And when the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And of course, at this point, jaws are dropping. Now, we already know that what Jesus is doing and saying is starting to ruffle the feathers of the religious leaders. In this particular case, it is the scribes or the teachers of the law, those educated in the laws of Moses, the Old Testament, and the traditions of this group called the Pharisees. It is their scribes that have come to scope out what Jesus is doing and to witness who Jesus is hanging out with. Of course, he calls Levi. So Jesus has this habit, by the way, if you haven't noticed, of going along the seaside, and calling people. Except this time, rather than seeing some guys that are tired and gritty from cleaning their nets and doing their fishing thing, he's found a tax booth. Now, don't think like Lucy from the Peanuts gang's little booth where she's got like psychology for a nickel. This is more of a permanent building. And if you remember last week, I pointed out that oftentimes in these towns, the homes and the businesses were connected building by building. Oftentimes people even ran businesses out of their homes. It's likely that the tax booth is more of a tax building that was set up by Herod, or at least Herod's people, to be tax collecting. And they would collect taxes of all sorts. They'd collect the main taxes off of everybody, but they would also tax goods that were being imported and exported, and that would come from place to place. As you saw on that picture/map, the towns are all marked along the seaside here, but of course, things could be imported and exported that come from the Sea of Galilee. I don't know, like fish or fish product. So Jesus is, well, he's not only shocking the Pharisees, but before we even get to that part of the story, we need to use our imaginations a bit and consider who else Jesus is shocking. He called Simon and Andrew and the sons of Zebedee, James and John, they'll later be called the sons of thunder. And these guys were all fishermen. And they said yes. And not only did they say yes, but Jesus decided that part of my program of making you my disciple means I'm going to be staying at your house most of the time. And they let him stay in. Everything was looking good. Until he walks along and shows up at the tax building and calls Levi. Because now Jesus is calling to be one of his disciples an adversary to the guys that he's already called to be his disciples. I don't know if you've ever been in a group project before, or maybe a sports team, or maybe you just have coworkers that don't share your opinions, you don't get along. You know, you kind of have to make do, but you try to avoid as best as possible because you're going to get into an argument or a spat at some point if you're in the room together for too long. Imagine that and ratchet it up by 100. Because the fishermen that were following Jesus are not going to like the tax collector that has chosen to follow Jesus. So their jaws are naturally going to drop at the thought that Jesus would call Levi. There's something else that you should know about Levi, though. It's his name. And no, it's not just that Levi and Matthew are probably the same person. If you're familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, their stories are kind of similar. And it's not uncommon for people to have multiple names. In fact, Simon becomes Peter thanks to the name Jesus gives him. It's not that part of his name. It's the fact that he's named Levi. It should clue you into something. Levi is not a Roman. He's a fellow Jewish person. So you remember when I was talking about the tax structures that were set up at this time, people that lived in these areas were oftentimes called into the service of being tax collectors. It was their only opportunity for work. And the people that lived in Capernaum and Bethsaida and the areas around the Galilee Sea were oftentimes Jewish people, just like the fishermen, just like the trade workers, just like the farmers. Levi was relegated as an outsider because of his profession, not because of his DNA, not because of his religious background, not because of his location. Everything but his place of employment made him one of Peter and Simon and James and John and Jesus. But his designated space of work made him an outsider because he was fraternizing with the enemy. He was doing bidding for the enemy. He was making a living from the enemy. And yet Jesus called him. And then we get to the fact that this story, I don't know if you caught this, it kind of jumps and skips points here. Jesus calls Levi, says, "Follow me." Levi's like, "All right, I'll do that." Next thing you know, they're at Levi's home. You should know something about the Greek here. The Greek often doesn't say Levi or Jesus, it just says he. So we're not entirely 100% positive that he was at Levi's home. It could have been at the home of Jesus, which really would have been the home of Simon and Andrew. But I'm just going to guess that since the roof is missing and Jesus was going around the sea, that it is the case that Levi invited them over. And there are other instances where Levi was invited to the homes of tax collectors and sinners, as well as the Pharisees. Jesus got invited to eat a lot, and he said yes, a lot. So he's in the home of Levi, and other people that were part of Levi's work group, other tax collectors and sinners. By the way, I don't know if you noticed that it's tax collectors and sinners, as if tax collector is its own special category of sinner. And by the way, the Pharisees at this time probably relegated anybody that went outside of the bounds of their view of purity as sinners. So we're not necessarily talking about people that have outright broken moral code, like liars and murderers and thieves and all this. We're talking about people that are getting this social designation as sinner because they don't look the part of expectation by the religious leaders at the time. So Levi is a tax collector and sinner hanging out with other tax collectors and sinners. And now Jesus is hanging out in his home with all of them. And you should know something about meals in the first century. I think I made a joke about the Passion of the Christ last week. I'm going to make another one again. Actually, the same one. Did you all see the movie The Passion of the Christ back in 2004? Anybody? You want to raise their hands? Put them in the air like you just don't care. All right, there you go. So if you saw that movie, I know the brutality of the movie is the thing that you probably remember the most. But oftentimes, as Jesus is going through the Passion, we get little snapshots into his background. And at one point, he's hanging out with his mom, Mary, and he stops and he shows her something that he made because he's a carpenter, right? And he makes a chair and he sits it down and he has her sit in it. And she's perplexed, like, this is weird. And if you're looking, according to Mel Gibson, Jesus invented the first chair. The problem with that is that's not how people sat around the table. In fact, sitting around the table is bad verbiage. What they actually did was they reclined around the table. The table was typically low, and I'm not going to do the pose, but if you ever see somebody laying on their side with, for a pose in a picture, it's kind of like that, except their head is up where they would be eating, and their legs are laying out like this. And oftentimes the other people around you are up against you and reclining with you. And you ate with your hands. So the portrait I'm painting here is that Jesus wasn't just hanging around like we would think around a dinner table with chairs and we've got our space so we don't elbow each other. Jesus was dipping in with whatever the food was with them. They were reclining against him, and he was reclining against them. There was physical contact. There was no space to eat. You ate with people. You were physically touching the untouchable people if you were Jesus in Levi's home. You were physically touching the untouchable who the Pharisees would have deemed untouchable, but also the disciples that you already began to make were untouchable. And there's one last part I want to point out about this story of Levi. It's the fact that the story even happened altogether. See, we see this designation, tax collectors and sinners, and we immediately think Jesus has intentionally gone out to get the lowest of low, the murderers, the thieves, and the crooked people. But that would do a disservice to who Levi is and what's actually happening. Levi, just like his other fellow Jewish people, were hungry to be godly people. And they were open to the Messiah. And when the Messiah calls you to be his disciple, you say yes. I mean, how could you resist the power, the authority, the wisdom that Jesus is teaching? Of course, you say yes. See, the problem for the Pharisees and even the problem for Jesus' other disciples, the fishermen, is that everybody's okay with Jesus calling the hungry for God to him, as long as they're just like you and me. But just because they look different doesn't mean that they're not hungry for God. And I started out and I quoted Paul at the beginning. Bad company ruins good morals. I would advise you to not take that and misapply it to this situation with Levi. Jesus has not called a wretched, horrible person that wants nothing to do with God. He has called someone that is in desperate need of God, who knows it and is willing to answer the call to be a disciple. Have you ever considered what the word disciple means? We use it in church. It means pupil or student. To be a disciple means that you recognize that what the teacher has, I don't, and I want it and I need it, and I'm willing to go learn. Jesus not only calls these disciples, he also tells them at the end of his ministry, again, spoiler alert, to go make disciples. A disciple, by mere meaning of the word, means that they don't have it all together. They need what the teacher has to give them. Jesus isn't calling people that don't want what he has to give. He's calling people that desperately want and need what he has to give. And he's willing to give it to anyone, no matter what they do, no matter what they look like, no matter who they are. Even if the people he already called into the club don't like them. And even if the people that make the clubs don't like them. Why? Well, Jesus has the authority to do whatever he wants because he's God in the flesh. And if you're his disciple, do you know whose rule matters the most? Not Herod Antipas, not the Pharisees, not even the fishermen. It's his way or the highway. When he wants you as a disciple, you matter. And when he tells you to make disciples, whoever matters to him now matters to you. Because what does he close this little section with to the Pharisees who question his disciples? By the way, they didn't even have the audacity to question Jesus himself. They went around to the guys that they know might have a problem with what Jesus is doing. Could you imagine? Just imagine, they're trying to stir up trouble in Jesus' little group already. They probably went to Simon and Andrew and James and John and said, "Can you believe this, guys? I get why he called you. You're good Jewish fishermen. But what is your teacher doing hanging around tax collectors and sinners?" And you can imagine the Pharisees wanted them to say, "I know, we thought the same thing." Instead, Jesus jumps in and he basically is like, "Yeah, I'm not even going to let you guys answer the question. You're just students." And he says, it's not the healthy who need a physician, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, Jesus, by the way, isn't making a statement about whether the Pharisees are on the righteous or sinners' side, or even making a statement about whether Levi is on the righteous or sinners' side. The problem is that they've assumed that Levi and his companions, the tax collectors, are by virtue of their work in the sinner category, and therefore on the outside of the sphere of people that God loves. And Jesus has a different assessment of the situation. Because do you know who Jesus makes disciples out of? It's the people that when he says, "Come follow me," get up and do it. That's what a disciple is. And even people like Levi can be a disciple. Which begs the question, are you a disciple? Do you want to be? Do you want to be like the Levi's of the world, or do you want to be in your own group where you feel like you've got some sort of stature or something? Do you want to be those people that put all the right people around so that you can really make it ahead in life and make sure that you don't get any of the dirt and grime of the sinners on you? Well, here's the thing. Jesus called people like Levi to be his disciples just as much as he called people like Simon and Andrew and James and John to be disciples. At some point, you were called to be his disciple. And I don't know all of your background and history, but I know all the people in this room come from different walks of life. And if it weren't for Jesus, y'all might not hang out with each other very often. It's one of the reasons I've loved being in small groups over the years. I've formed friendships with people I never would have got along with. I mean, I've got friends that are Steelers fans. Can you believe that? Oh, did you guys have a bad game yesterday? I'm sorry. Here's the thing. If you want to be a disciple of Jesus, the requirement is that you want what he has to give you. But the catch is that if you want what he has to give you, you have to want it for the other people that you might not think belong. That's the trick about being called to be a disciple, is there's always going to be the call to make disciples at the end of it. And it might not look like the way you think it should. But Jesus is the one in charge, and he is the ultimate disciple maker. Levi was a disciple. Will you be one? And if you will, are you willing to find the Levi's in your life? Because Jesus wants to call him or her, just like he called you. I hope that on your way in you got a communion packet. We take communion each week because we remember that Jesus was so serious about his love for us and his desire to make us his disciples that he laid down his life for us. Each week we eat the bread and we drink of the cup because we remember that they represent his body given for us and his blood poured out for us. Jesus not only talked the talk, but he walked the walk. He was willing to lose a roof to heal people. He was willing to lean up against the outcasts in order to save them. And he was willing to die for anyone and everyone that would have him as Lord and Savior. And so I'm going to give us a moment to pause and contemplate what Jesus has done for us. And after that moment of reflection, we will take communion together as one church family. I invite each and every one of you to take the bread from this cup and eat. This is his body, which is given for us. And likewise, as he commanded, take and drink from this cup. This is his blood, which is poured out for us. Please pray with me. Dear Lord God, we thank you for being good to us. We thank you for calling us to be your disciples. We thank you that no matter who we are, what we've done, where we've come from, that you valued us enough to call us as your own. And I pray, God, that as we reflect on what Jesus did throughout the gospel story in calling people like Levi, that we will be not only in awe of your grace for us, that you thought something of us, even if we don't measure up, and we likely don't. But I also pray, God, that in the recognition of the grace that you've given us, that we will see others as you do, and that we will recognize that they are invited into the call. And if there are those in this room right now that haven't answered that call yet, I pray that you will stir within their heart by the power of your Spirit to help them to answer yes, to be baptized, and to begin the walk of being your student so that they can learn your ways and learn your words and echo them in their own lives. We thank you for being good to us, and it's in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.